queries are these 10,000 agents, potentially 10,000 agents doing, who have access to this information, how many are they doing on U.S. persons? And that answer from the IG was 3 million in one calendar year, 2021. The IG also told us that 278,000 of those searches on U.S. persons were most definitely done in an improper way. And what that meant by improper is they didn't follow the rules Congress had set. They didn't follow the FBI rules. So they didn't follow our rules, and they didn't even follow their own rules when they were doing these unbelievable millions of searches, 278,000 definitely done improperly, and the potential of 10,000 people at the FBI to do those very searches. And who were they searching? Who are some of the people?
You just heard it, and you probably need to hear it again because the magnitude of what Jim Jordan just revealed should be shaking the foundations of your understanding of democracy in America, should be sending tremors through the corridors of power, should be making every single person who believes in the Constitution question whether we live in a republic or a surveillance empire, dressed up in the tattered robes of constitutional governance, because 3 million searches in 1 year, 3 million times the Federal Bureau of Investigation queried databases containing the communications of American citizens without warrants, without probable cause, without the basic protections that the framers of our Constitution understood to be so essential to liberty, that they wrote them into the Fourth Amendment in language so clear that even the most duplicitous government bureaucrat should understand it. And yet here we are in 2024, watching a member of Congress stand before cameras explaining that these searches unjustly targeted individuals, including members of Congress, 141 Black Lives Matter protesters, 19,000 donors to a congressional campaign, a local political party, tens of thousands of people involved in civil unrest, visitors to FBI offices, and individuals based solely on their race. And you need to let that sink in, because we are not talking about some distant authoritarian regime, not discussing the surveillance apparatus of the Soviet Union, or the Stasi, or some nightmarish dystopia imagined by Orwell. We are talking about the United States of America, where the intelligence apparatus has been turned inward against its own citizens, with a ferocity and scope that should terrify anyone who understands that power unchecked becomes tyranny, inevitably, and absolutely. Wait, because it gets worse, and you need to stay with me here because FBI agents performed improper searches for the private communications of a U.S. senator, a state senator, and a state court judge who reported alleged civil rights violations by a police chief to the FBI, which means that when an elected official dared to exercise oversight, when a judge attempted to uphold civil rights, the same agency tasked with protecting those rights turned its surveillance machinery against them, in what can only be described as retaliation, dressed up as national security. And this is not conjecture. This is documented fact emerging from the government's own Inspector General reports and court opinions that describe numerous recent violations of legal requirements and court-ordered rules intended to protect Americans' privacies. And yet, despite this avalanche of evidence, despite these egregious violations, the Senate voted 60-34 to reauthorize Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act for 2 more years in April 2024, extending a surveillance program that intelligence agencies have used to turn into a go-to domestic spying authority, using it to conduct hundreds of thousands of warrantless backdoor searches for Americans' private communications every year. But here is where the progressive movement needs to wake up and understand the intersectionality of surveillance and systemic oppression, because this is not just about abstract civil liberties. This is about how power structures target dissent and marginalized communities with surgical precision. And you need to understand that when 141 Black Lives Matter protesters have their communications searched without warrants, when racial justice activists are subjected to dragnet surveillance simply for demanding that Black lives be valued as much as white lives, we are witnessing the continuation of a historical pattern that stretches back through COINTELPRO to the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr., and the FBI spied on and attempted to blackmail the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but King was just one of thousands of people targeted by federal agents who employed a wide variety of illegal tactics, which Congress supposedly addressed by passing FISA in 1978. Yet here we stand decades later watching history repeat itself, because power never willingly relinquishes the tools of oppression. It simply finds new legal frameworks to justify the same authoritarian impulses. And listen carefully, because the scale of this surveillance dragnet is almost incomprehensible to the human mind. In the 12-month period ending November 30, 2021, FBI reported 3,394,053 U.S. person queries consisting of 2,964,643 unique query terms, which means that in a single year, the FBI conducted more warrantless searches of Americans' communications than there are people in the city of Chicago, more invasions of privacy than there are words in 100 novels. In the last year alone, the FBI conducted over 200,000 warrantless backdoor searches of Americans' communications, averaging more than 500 searches every single day, which means that while you were sleeping last night, while you were going to work this morning, while you were reading this commentary, FBI agents were rummaging through databases containing the private communications of American citizens without obtaining warrants, without demonstrating probable cause, without even following their own internal guidelines, because this egregious violation of Americans' privacy rights is compounded by the regular violations of the minimal rules governing backdoor searches. Now pay attention, because this next part reveals the class dimensions of surveillance capitalism and how the security state partners with corporate power to create a totalizing system of social control. Because FBI agents use Section 702 databases to conduct millions of invasive searches for Americans' communications, including those of protesters, racial justice activists, 19,000 donors to a congressional campaign, journalists, and even members of Congress without a warrant. And think about what it means that political donors are being surveilled, that the act of participating in democracy by contributing to a congressional campaign subjects you to potential FBI scrutiny, that exercising your First Amendment right to support candidates becomes grounds for warrantless surveillance in a country that claims to be the world's beacon of freedom. And this is not hyperbole. This is documented reality that the FBI has improperly searched foreign surveillance information using the last names of a U.S. senator and a state-level politician. And the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board reported that the FBI alone searched Section 702 databases for information on U.S. persons nearly 5 million times over 3 years. But here is where it gets absolutely infuriating, and you need to feel this rage in your bones, because when Congress had the opportunity to reform this Orwellian nightmare, when amendments were proposed to require the FBI to obtain warrants before searching Americans' communications, Senators shot down 6 amendments that would have reined in the U.S. intelligence agency's abilities to carry out effectively warrantless surveillance under Section 702, including an amendment that would have required federal agencies to show probable cause and obtain a warrant, and this happened despite 76% of Americans supporting requiring the government to obtain a warrant before searching Section 702 data for Americans' communication, which means that we live in an oligarchic surveillance state, where the will of 3/4 of the population is completely ignored by a bipartisan coalition of national security hawks who believe that the Constitution is a suggestion rather than the supreme law of the land. And wait, because the hypocrisy is so breathtaking, it deserves its own moment of reckoning. A bill to renew Section 702 would afford special treatment to members of Congress, adding a requirement that lawmakers be notified when they are the subject of an FBI search under the program, and the FBI would notify a member who is the subject of a search, which means that the same legislators who voted to subject ordinary Americans to warrantless surveillance carved out special protections for themselves, creating a 2-tiered system of rights where members of Congress receive notifications before their communications are searched, while regular citizens remain in the dark. And Reverend Pramila Jayapal called attention to the provision, writing that the bill would mean the FBI has to notify Congress members to spy on us, but regular Americans can be spied on without a warrant, exposing the naked class privilege embedded in legislation that treats elected officials as deserving of constitutional protections while subjecting their constituents to surveillance without due process. Now let us talk about the procedural corruption, because the board identified batch backdoor searches as a persistent source of compliance violations, noting multiple batch queries that were incorrectly identified as containing no Americans when in reality, tens of thousands of Americans were included in the searches, which means that the FBI's internal safeguards are so incompetent or so deliberately flawed that searches supposedly targeting foreigners accidentally hoover up tens of thousands of Americans, and nobody faces accountability, nobody gets fired, nobody goes to jail for systematically violating the Fourth Amendment rights of American citizens. And errors of this magnitude, which were discovered during a partial audit of the FBI's use of Section 702, indicate that the abuses we know about may only be the tip of the iceberg, suggesting that what has been revealed through painstaking oversight and whistleblower disclosures represents merely a fraction of the total surveillance state apparatus operating in the shadows. And here is where we need to connect this to the broader architecture of authoritarian control, because surveillance is never neutral. It is always deployed to protect existing power structures and suppress challenges to those structures. Some of the queries found by the report were explicitly domestic in nature, including those related to instances of civil unrest and protests, which means that when Americans exercise their First Amendment rights to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, when they march in the streets demanding justice, the surveillance state treats that constitutionally protected activity as suspicious, as potentially criminal, as worthy of warrantless investigation, and this is exactly how authoritarian regimes operate, by criminalizing dissent, by treating political opposition as a security threat, by using the machinery of state surveillance to chill civic participation and create a climate of fear where citizens self-censor rather than risk becoming targets. But hold on, because we need to examine how the Biden administration completely failed progressives on this issue, how Democrats who claim to champion civil liberties and constitutional rights became complicit in extending surveillance powers because Attorney General Merrick Garland described Section 702 as indispensable to the Justice Department's work to protect the American people, while claiming the reauthorization codifies important reforms the Justice Department has adopted to ensure the protection of Americans' privacy and civil liberties, which is Orwellian doublespeak of the highest order given that U.S. officials have revealed a series of abuses and mistakes by FBI analysts in improperly querying the intelligence repository for information about Americans or others in the U.S., including a member of Congress and participants in the racial justice protests of 2020 and the Jan. 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol, meaning that even as evidence mounted of systematic violations, the Democratic administration lobbied for reauthorization without meaningful reforms. And this is where the left needs to have an honest reckoning with the fact that civil liberties violations are bipartisan, that the national security state operates with near impunity regardless of which party controls the White House or Congress, because despite what some members would like the public to believe, Section 702 has been abused under presidents from both political parties, and it has been used to unlawfully surveil the communications of Americans across the political spectrum, and senior national security officials, including Attorney General Merrick Garland, personally called members of Congress in the immediate lead-up to the vote and urged them to oppose the amendment requiring warrants, with the Biden administration distributing a memo characterizing it as a threat to national security, which reveals that even supposedly progressive administrations will choose surveillance power over constitutional rights when given the choice. Now consider the chilling effect this has on journalism, and you will understand why this is not just about privacy, but about the very possibility of democratic accountability. Because the U.S. government has repeatedly used Section 702 to conduct warrantless surveillance of Americans, including protesters, members of Congress, and journalists, and when journalists know their communications may be monitored, when sources understand that contacting a reporter could subject them to FBI scrutiny, the entire ecosystem of investigative journalism that holds power accountable begins to collapse, sources stop coming forward, journalists self-censor, and the public loses access to information about government malfeasance, creating a perfect feedback loop where surveillance enables corruption, which enables more surveillance to hide that corruption. The FBI's COINTELPRO initiative, which was active from 1956 to 1971, infiltrated, surveilled, and disrupted civil rights organizations, anti-war movements, and other progressive groups, with the FBI surveilling figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and Congress supposedly reformed the FBI and passed FISA to prevent future abuses, yet here we stand watching the same patterns repeat with modern technology, enabling surveillance on a scale that J. Edgar Hoover could only dream of. These FBI surveillance targets may not have been monitored for criminal activity, but instead for challenging social norms and advocating for change, with the FBI's motivations likely based on political bias rather than real security concerns, which is exactly what we see today, when Black Lives Matter protesters and political donors become surveillance targets. But here is what really exposes the hollowness of the national security justification. The board's report calls into question whether routine spying on Americans has produced a significant amount of useful information, noting the government provided little justification on the relative value of the close to 5 million backdoor searches conducted by the FBI from 2019 to 2022, and that the FBI identified few cases in which a backdoor search provided unique value or otherwise advanced a criminal investigation, which means that millions of warrantless searches of Americans' communications yielded almost no actionable intelligence, that this massive invasion of privacy produced virtually nothing of value for national security, yet the surveillance continues, because the security state is interested not in protecting Americans, but in maintaining its own power and budgets and institutional prerogatives, And now let us talk about the expansion of surveillance that was actually included in the reauthorization, because one opinion describes a completely new use of Section 702 surveillance by the NSA to conduct routine suspicionless searches of people overseas who are applying for immigration benefits or seeking to travel to the United States, with these suspicionless queries unprecedented under Section 702, and this novel use of the spy program for immigration and travel purposes impacting the privacy of Americans who are in contact with people seeking to come to the United States, with the NSA's use of warrantless FISA surveillance to vet immigrants and travelers being a dramatic expansion never authorized by Congress, which reveals how surveillance powers inevitably expand beyond their original justification, how national security becomes the excuse for monitoring immigrants and travelers, and anyone who communicates with them, creating a vast dragnet that sweeps up millions of innocent people. Now wait, because we need to discuss the fundamental constitutional argument and why the Fourth Amendment exists in the first place, because the Fourth Amendment guarantees the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and government agents are required to obtain a warrant to access our emails, online messages, and chats. And this is not some technical legal nicety. This is a fundamental protection against government tyranny that the founders understood was essential after experiencing British soldiers searching homes without warrants. The standard for conducting backdoor searches is so low that without any showing of suspicion, an FBI agent can type in an American's name, email address, or phone number and pull up whatever communications the FBI's Section 702 collection has vacuumed into its databases over the past 5 years, which means we have created exactly the kind of general warrants that the Fourth Amendment was designed to prohibit. And consider the sheer Kafkaesque absurdity of the government's position that the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York held that warrantless queries conducted under Section 702 violated the Fourth Amendment, with the ruling the first of its kind, following years of public revelations about how Section 702 has been used to conduct warrantless surveillance of Americans, including protesters, members of Congress, and journalists. And yet, despite a federal court explicitly ruling these searches unconstitutional, despite documented evidence of systematic violations, Congress reauthorized the program anyway, with only cosmetic reforms, demonstrating that constitutional rights mean nothing when they conflict with the prerogatives of the national security state. But progressives need to understand that this is not just about surveillance. This is about the fundamental question of whether we live in a democracy or a security state, whether the people control the government or the government controls the people, because the FBI's domestic surveillance activities can have far-reaching consequences for the preservation of democratic governance and civil liberties, with targeting of individuals or groups based on political views or religious beliefs undermining foundational principles of freedom of speech, assembly, and religion that are essential to sustaining democratic processes. And when the surveillance state treats political activism as suspicious, when it monitors religious communities and racial justice protesters and political donors, it is not protecting democracy. It is undermining democracy by making civic participation dangerous. And here is what makes this moment so critical. In April 2024, Congress passed the Reforming Intelligence and Securing America Act to reauthorize Section 702, with the legislation substantially amending FISA by imposing new privacy safeguards including expanding oversight and holding the FBI more accountable. But as Section 702's 2026 expiration date approaches, Congress must consider further reforms that extend beyond the ERISA, which means that we have a 2-year window to organize, to mobilize, to demand real reforms that actually protect constitutional rights, rather than rubber-stamping surveillance powers, and the progressive movement needs to make civil liberties a central priority, because surveillance disproportionately targets marginalized communities, racial justice activists, immigrants, Muslims, anyone who challenges existing power structures. Now think about the institutional corruption revealed by Jim Jordan's own role in this, because Jordan released a more than 17,000-page report detailing work by the House Weaponization Subcommittee, claiming to uncover numerous examples of federal government abuses, and while Jordan cynically uses surveillance abuses to attack his political enemies, he offers no serious reforms to actually constrain the security state, revealing how even supposed critics of the deep state are perfectly happy to maintain surveillance powers they might one day control. And this is why civil liberties must be defended on principle rather than partisan grounds, because today's surveillance target could be tomorrow's administration, and power unchecked will always be abused regardless of who wields it. And we need to talk about the role of corporate complicity, because through PRISM, the NSA obtains communications directly from U.S. tech and social media companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, and Microsoft, with the government identifying non-US person accounts it wishes to monitor, and then ordering the company to disclose all communications to and from those accounts, including communications with US persons, which means that the companies we trust with our most intimate communications, our private messages, our personal emails, are compelled to hand that data over to intelligence agencies, who then search through it without warrants, and these corporations face no accountability, suffer no consequences, because they can hide behind national security letters and gag orders that prevent them from even disclosing the scope of surveillance to their users. Listen, because the numbers are so staggering they need to be repeated. When the government first began releasing statistics after the Snowden revelations in 2013, it reported having 89,138 targets, but by 2021, the government was targeting the communications of a staggering 232,432 individuals, groups, and organizations, which represents more than a doubling of surveillance targets in less than a decade, proving that surveillance powers inevitably expand, that national security justifications are infinitely elastic, that giving government the ability to spy on citizens without warrants will always result in more spying on more people for more reasons, until the surveillance state becomes totalizing and ubiquitous. And consider what this means for the future of resistance and social movement, because every protest organizer, every racial justice activist, every climate justice advocate, every labor organizer, every immigrant rights defender, everyone challenging the status quo now operates with the knowledge that their communications may be monitored, their networks may be mapped, their strategies may be known to law enforcement before they even act, and questionable FBI surveillance activities can erode public trust in law enforcement and domestic security operations, with the chilling effect of biased or poorly managed domestic surveillance activities cannot be overstated, as knowing that people's lives and activities may be monitored due to political activism or religious practices can result in self-censorship, stifling dissenting opinions, and weakening the fabric of civil society, which is precisely the authoritarian outcome the surveillance state produces, regardless of whether it intends to. But here is where we need to be strategic about resistance, because, outraged by these abuses, many lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have vowed not to reauthorize the law without significant reforms, with the key reform under consideration being to require the government to obtain a warrant before examining Americans' private communications captured through Section 702 surveillance, and this is the minimum acceptable standard. This is not radical. This is simply requiring the government to follow the Constitution. And the fact that requiring warrants is treated as some kind of extreme position reveals how far we have descended into surveillance state authoritarianism, where following the Bill of Rights is considered too burdensome for law enforcement. And you need to understand the intersectional dimensions of this, because surveillance is a tool of oppression that reinforces every other form of systemic inequality. It targets Black and brown communities disproportionately. It monitors Muslim Americans as potential terrorists. It tracks immigrants seeking to enter the country. It scrutinizes protesters demanding economic justice, creating a matrix of surveillance that maps perfectly onto existing structures of white supremacy, capitalism, and imperial power. And this is why civil liberties cannot be separated from the broader struggle for justice, why privacy is not an individual right, but a collective necessity for anyone seeking to challenge entrenched power. So what do we do now? How do we respond to the revelation that the FBI conducted 3 million warrantless searches in a single year, that 278,000 of those searches were definitively improper, that members of Congress and journalists and protesters and political donors are all potential targets of surveillance? And the answer is that we organize, we mobilize, we make surveillance reform a litmus test for progressive candidates. We demand that civil liberties organizations prioritize this issue with the same urgency they bring to voting rights and criminal justice reform. We build coalitions across ideological lines, because surveillance threatens everyone regardless of political affiliation. We support whistleblowers who risk everything to expose these abuses. We pressure tech companies to resist government data requests. We encrypt our communications. We educate our communities about digital security. And most importantly, we refuse to accept the false choice between security and liberty, because a surveillance state that monitors its citizens without warrants does not make anyone safer. It only makes everyone less free, and if we do not act now, if we do not treat this as the constitutional crisis it truly is, we will wake up one day in a country where dissent is impossible, where resistance is futile, where the surveillance state knows everything about everyone and uses that knowledge to maintain power indefinitely. And that is not a future worth accepting. That is a dystopia worth fighting with everything we have, because the choice before us is clear. We either restore constitutional governance and meaningful limits on surveillance power, or we surrender to authoritarianism dressed up in the language of national security, and that is a surrender that will haunt generations to come.